The year was 1918. The world was already suffering. A terrible war, World War I, was coming to an end, and many countries were left in ruins. Cities were broken, families were torn apart, and soldiers were returning home with pain in their hearts. People hoped for peace and a fresh start. But something worse was coming, something silent, something deadly. It did not carry guns, but it would kill more people than the war itself. This was the Spanish flu. It started quietly, like a whisper. A soldier in Kansas, USA, woke up feeling tired and feverish. His name was Albert Gitchell, a cook at Camp Funston. It was March 4th, 1918. He thought it was just a cold. Maybe he had worked too much. Maybe the cold wind had caught him the day before. But within hours, over 100 soldiers at the camp fell sick. By the end of the week, more than 500 were ill. Doctors were surprised. How could one soldier make so many people sick so quickly? This was no ordinary flu. People coughed uncontrollably. Their muscles ached. Their skin turned blue. Some had nosebleeds and others could hardly breathe. In many cases, the sick died within 24 to 48 hours. Hospitals became crowded. Nurses worked day and night. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others got sick too. And then just as quickly as it came, the illness seemed to disappear from the camp. But it did not die. It traveled. America was sending soldiers to Europe to fight in the war. These soldiers carried more than weapons. They unknowingly carried the flu across the ocean. In the tight and crowded ships, the virus spread like wildfire. By April, it was in France, then Spain, then England, then Germany. It moved with trains, boats, and soldiers on foot. No country was safe. No village was too small. No person too strong. People began calling it the Spanish flu. But it didn't really start in Spain. During the war, most countries did not allow newspapers to report bad news. They feared it would weaken the spirit of the people. But Spain was not part of the war, so their newspapers were free. When their king, Alfonso XIII, caught the flu, Spanish papers reported it. Other countries, hearing about it, mostly from Spain, began calling it the Spanish flu. In truth, the virus was already spreading everywhere. It just wasn't being reported. By the summer of 1918, the flu had reached India, China, Africa, and South America. The whole world was getting sick. At first, many thought it was just a stronger kind of regular flu. But then came the second wave. It was August when the second wave began, and it was far worse. This time, it killed quickly and painfully. People drowned in their own lungs as they filled with fluid. Entire families got sick together. In some towns, there were not enough coffins. In others, people died faster than they could be buried. And strangely, the people dying weren't just the very old or very young, like with normal flu. Many of the dead were young adults, people in their 20s and 30s. Doctors were confused. Why would the strong die first? Scientists today believe that the strongest immune systems may have reacted too strongly to the virus. The body's own defenses caused massive damage inside. They call it a cytokine storm. But back then, doctors did not know this. They had no cure, no vaccine, no real protection, only masks, soap, and distance. In many places, life stopped. Schools closed. Theaters shut their doors. Churches stopped holding services. Funerals were short, with few people attending. In some towns, no one was allowed to shake hands or even talk in public. People were told to wear masks and avoid large crowds. Some obeyed, others laughed at the idea. But the virus did not care. It came anyway. In Philadelphia, USA, a big parade was held in September to raise money for the war. Despite warnings, the city allowed it. Thousands came to watch. Marching bands played, soldiers waved, and children cheered. 3 days later, hospitals were full. Within a week, thousands were dead. Morgues ran out of space. Bodies were stacked in hallways. The smell of death filled the air. This scene repeated in cities around the world. In Britain, families kept their windows closed tight. They feared the air. In South Africa, towns closed their borders. In Japan, people burned herbs, hoping the smoke would protect them. But nothing worked. The Spanish flu was everywhere. Doctors were helpless. They tried all kinds of treatments: bleeding, whiskey, aspirin, garlic, and even onions. But nothing stopped the virus. Nurses were in short supply. Many were just volunteers, untrained and afraid. Medicine was limited. People relied on home remedies and prayer. And through it all, the war continued. Soldiers died both on the battlefield and in hospital beds. In fact, some historians believe that the flu helped end the war. Armies were too weak to fight. Soldiers could barely lift their weapons. Leaders on both sides were scared, not just of bombs, but of sickness. When the war ended on November 11, 1918, people rushed into the streets to celebrate. They hugged, kissed, and danced. But the virus was still there. Celebrations became new outbreaks. The flu kept spreading. By the end of 1918, the second wave had passed. But the Spanish flu would return one more time, in early 1919. The third wave was smaller, but still deadly. When it was finally over, the world counted its dead. At least 50 million people had died. Some experts believe the number could be as high as 100 million. 1/3 of the world's population had been infected. Every continent had suffered. Every country had buried its dead. The Spanish flu was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. And yet, today, few people talk about it. Why? Because the world wanted to forget. People were tired of pain, tired of war, tired of sickness. They wanted to move on. There were no big memorials, no history lessons, just silence. But the story of the Spanish flu must be remembered. It reminds us how fragile life is, how fast things can change, how a tiny virus can bring the world to its knees. And it reminds us to be ready, because another pandemic could come again. And next time, we must not forget. The cold wind of early 1919 swept through city streets and quiet villages alike. In many homes, curtains were always drawn. Some were drawn in mourning. Others were drawn to keep out the sickness that traveled through the air. But the virus did not respect closed windows or locked doors. It crept into homes, trains, ships, and even royal palaces. And everywhere it went, it brought fear. In London, newspapers began to tell stories of the dying. Hospitals were filled beyond their limits. Doctors could do nothing but offer water and hope. Some patients coughed so hard that their ribs cracked. Many couldn't even lie down because their lungs were drowning from within. They sat up in bed, gasping, choking, eyes wide with terror. Then, silence. Outside the hospital walls, streets were emptier than ever before. People wore cloth masks soaked in chemicals, hoping to protect themselves. Some wore bags of herbs around their necks. Children were told not to speak to strangers. Posters were hung on walls: "Spit kills," "Cover your cough," and "Stay home if you're sick." In a small English village, a girl named Elsie watched from her window. She was 10 years old. Her mother had caught the flu 3 days before. Now she lay in bed, eyes closed, face pale. Elsie's father was gone. He had died in the war. Her older brother had gone to the city to find work and had not returned. She was alone with her mother. The doctor had come once, shook his head, and left. He could do no more. Elsie boiled water, made tea, and wiped her mother's forehead with a cold cloth. She didn't know much about illness, but she knew her mother was fading. At night she sat by the bed, whispering prayers she barely understood. She told stories aloud, hoping her mother could hear. Outside, the church bell rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Another death. Each day, the bell rang more often. In cities across Europe, life was much the same. Shops closed, markets emptied, schools shut down, coffins lined the streets. There were not enough undertakers. In some towns, farmers were hired to bury the dead. In others, people were buried in mass graves wrapped in sheets. In Paris, a young nurse named Marie was one of the few who stayed to help. She had lost her parents to the flu. Now she worked long hours at a hospital filled with soldiers and civilians. She wore a mask made of gauze and cotton. She washed her hands so often they cracked and bled. Still, she kept going. She held hands as people died. She whispered kind words to those who had no family left. The flu showed no mercy. It killed rich and poor, young and old. Even world leaders were not safe. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson fell ill with the flu while attending the peace talks in Paris. He survived, but some say his sickness affected his decisions during those important meetings. In Australia, ships arriving from overseas were forced to quarantine for weeks, but the flu still made it to land. In South Africa, it struck down thousands in rural villages where there were no doctors. In India, millions died, many of them without even being counted. The disease spread faster than any news could. One of the most frightening things was how quickly everything changed. A person could feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. There were stories of entire families dying within days. In some places, pets roamed the streets, hungry and lost, after their owners were taken away. In the United States, cities tried different ways to stop the spread. Some banned public gatherings, others made masks mandatory. In San Francisco, if someone was caught without a mask, they could be fined or even jailed. But not everyone listened. Some thought the rules were too strict. Others believed the flu was just like a cold. These people gathered in secret, visited friends, or attended church. The virus did not respect opinions. In one case, a group of people met for a wedding in the countryside. Everyone was smiling, dancing, and hugging. 3 days later, the bride, the groom, and more than half of the guests were dead. By early spring 1919, the third wave began to fade. Fewer people were getting sick. Hospitals were finally seeing empty beds. Doctors began to breathe easier. People came out of their homes, blinking at the sunlight they had not enjoyed in months. Some places held quiet memorials for those who had died. Others simply tried to move on. But the world had changed forever. Over 50 million people were gone, maybe more. Entire communities had been wiped out. Families had been broken. Children were left as orphans. Some survivors never recovered fully. The virus had weakened their bodies or left them with pain that never went away. In London, Elsie's mother eventually woke from her sickness. She was weak and confused, but she was alive. Elsie hugged her tightly, crying tears of joy. They had survived. Many others had not. In Paris, Marie, the nurse, walked through empty hospital halls. She was tired. Her hands were scarred, but she had saved lives, and that gave her strength. In small and large ways, people all over the world began to rebuild. They opened shops, replanted fields, reopened schools. But they spoke little of what had happened. Many were too sad, too tired, or too scared it could happen again. The Spanish flu had taught the world a painful lesson, that no one is safe from nature. Not kings, not soldiers, not children. It also taught people the value of kindness, of courage, of those who helped even when they were afraid. The flu left behind silence, but it also left behind stories. stories like Elsie's, stories like Marie's, and stories that remind us, even today, of a time when the whole world fell sick and somehow survived. The world had changed, but I didn't know how to talk about it. In early 1919, as the final wave of the Spanish flu faded, streets began to fill again. People stepped outside their homes like survivors after a storm. Some had lost their parents, siblings, or friends. Others had lost everything. Yet life had to continue. The war had ended, cities were rebuilding, and leaders were busy drawing new maps for the world. But the people who survived the flu pandemic were not the same anymore. Grief hung in the air like fog. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, too quiet. Families buried loved ones in silence. Many didn't even get to say goodbye. The virus had moved so fast that some were taken away before their names could be whispered one last time. In New York, a woman named Sarah stood at the harbor waiting. Her husband had left for Europe months earlier as a soldier. She had written him letters every week. But then, one day, a telegram arrived. He had died, not on the battlefield, but in a hospital, sick with the flu. Sarah never saw his face again. She never got to hold his hand. She now stood by the sea, watching the waves, wondering how something so small, so invisible, could have taken him from her. In villages across England, black ribbons were tied to doors. These ribbons signaled mourning. Many homes had them. In one village, a man named Thomas had lost his wife and both children. His house was quiet now. Too quiet. He sat by the fire every evening, staring into the flames, not because he wanted warmth, but because the silence scared him more. There were stories like this everywhere. In Italy, whole towns lost half their people. In Norway, small fishing communities had no young men left to sail. In Canada, schoolrooms had empty chairs that no one ever sat in again. The dead had left behind shadows, and the living did not know how to carry on. Yet, life was returning. Newspapers stopped reporting on the flu. People were tired of hearing about it. Governments did not want to scare their citizens any longer. Instead, they focused on rebuilding, on moving forward. But many doctors and nurses were still haunted by the things they had seen. They had watched people suffocate in their own beds. They had buried children without a name. They had told families again and again, "I'm sorry, there is nothing more we can do." Some of them began writing in journals, trying to record what had happened, even if no one wanted to read it. They knew that someday someone might need to remember. In one hospital in Dublin, a young doctor named Patrick wrote daily notes in a little book. His handwriting was shaky, and the pages were stained with ink and sometimes tears. He wrote, "Today we lost a mother of 3. She was only 27. Her youngest kept calling for her. We did not have the heart to tell him." He wrote again, "The wards are quiet now. Too quiet. I almost missed the noise. At least the noise meant people were still alive." Patrick's notes were never published, but years later, his granddaughter found them in a box. She read each line and cried. She realized that her grandfather had helped others during the worst time in history, and though he never spoke of it, he had done something brave. Across the ocean in America, many towns began to hold small memorials, not for heroes of war, but for those lost to the flu, but even these were rare. Most people didn't want to talk about the sickness. They wanted weddings, music, food, and laughter again. They wanted to forget. This forgetting became normal. By the mid-1920s, the Spanish flu was almost a ghost in history books. Children learned about wars, kings, and inventions, but not about the sickness that had killed millions. People didn't realize how unusual that was. After all, 50 to 100 million people had died. That was more than in the First World War, more than the Second. The flu had changed everything, yet no monument stood in its honor. No national day of mourning was declared. No statues were raised. The grief remained locked inside hearts, passed down quietly from generation to generation. In Sweden, a teacher named Corinne decided to tell her students about the flu. She asked them to interview their grandparents. Some returned with surprising stories. "My grandmother said people used to carry their dead on carts," one student said. "My grandfather said his brother went to bed after school and never woke up," another shared. As these stories came to light, people began to understand the size of what had happened, but most remained silent. No one wanted to reopen wounds. Instead, people focused on science. Doctors and scientists around the world began studying viruses more closely. They realized how dangerous a simple illness could be. They began building better hospitals, training more nurses, and teaching the importance of clean hands, fresh air, and proper care. Some scientists even started working on vaccines, not just for flu, but for many diseases. The Spanish flu had shaken the world awake. It had shown how connected the world truly was. A virus that started in a small military camp in Kansas had reached every corner of the planet in months. No country had been able to stop it. Some scientists warned that it could happen again, but few people listened. In time, people began to marry again, to have children, to build lives. The world grew brighter. The 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties in some countries, a time of jazz, parties, and inventions. People danced, drank, and laughed. They wanted to enjoy life, to leave the darkness behind. But for many, the grief never fully faded. In London, Elsie and her mother slowly rebuilt their lives. Her mother recovered, but was never quite the same. She coughed more often and tired easily. Elsie returned to school and made new friends, but she always remembered the long nights, the silence, the fear. In Paris, Marie the nurse left the hospital and became a teacher. She taught young girls how to care for others, how to be strong, how to be kind. She never talked much about the war or the flu. But sometimes, when a student asked why she became a nurse, she would pause, then simply say, "Because someone had to." In homes, in letters, in the quiet corners of the world, memories of the Spanish flu lived on. The world had been wounded, but it had survived, and deep inside, people carried the hope that such a thing would never happen again. By 1920, the world was waking up again. Shops reopened, children played in the streets, couples walked hand in hand under the sun, church bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. People smiled again, though the smiles were softer, sadder, and filled with memories they didn't speak of. But the Spanish flu had left more than grief. It had left lessons. Doctors, scientists, and ordinary people had witnessed something terrible. They had seen how a sickness could stop the whole world. Now, quietly and carefully, some of them began to prepare for the future. In the United States, a doctor named William Welch had worked during the worst days of the pandemic. He had seen young, strong men die within hours. He knew this wasn't just a regular flu. He called for more research into diseases, better hospitals, and stronger public health systems. His voice joined others who had seen the same horrors. In England, a young scientist named Christopher Andrews studied viruses in a small lab. He didn't know it yet, but he would one day help create the first flu vaccine. He, like many others, had grown up during the pandemic. He remembered the fear. That fear pushed him to learn more. Even regular people began to change their habits. In cities, public health rules became more common. Spitting in the streets was now illegal in many places. Doctors taught people how to wash hands properly. Posters about germs appeared in schools and train stations. People finally began to understand how invisible dangers could travel from person to person. In schools, however, the Spanish flu was rarely taught. Teachers focused on kings, queens, wars, and discoveries. The flu, though deadlier than all the battles, was hardly mentioned. Some thought it was too sad. Others believed it was just something that happened and should be forgotten. But not everyone forgot. In a small town in Ireland, a librarian named Nora began collecting stories. She had lived through the flu. Her sister had died in her arms. Nora didn't want the world to forget that pain, so she asked people to write their memories on paper. Old men, mothers, even children came to her library and told their stories. I remember waking up and hearing no birds. They say the birds had flown away from the town. Even they were scared, one woman wrote. My father dug graves for 3 days straight. No one else was left to do it. He never spoke again after that week, a man shared. Nora kept these stories in a box marked 1918. She believed that someday someone would read them and understand. Meanwhile, the world kept moving forward. The 1920s became a time of big change. Cars filled the streets, radios played music in homes, women gained the right to vote in many countries. People believed in science, in progress, in tomorrow. The darkness of the flu seemed like a bad dream, but sometimes the fear returned. In 1924, when a new flu appeared in some cities, people panicked. Shops sold out of masks again, some schools closed. But this flu was not as deadly, and it passed quickly. Still, it reminded people of how easily sickness could return. In hospitals, some nurses still kept their old uniforms, the ones stained with sweat and tears from 1918. They kept them as reminders of what they had seen and what they had survived. In homes, families told children to wash their hands, cover their mouths, and avoid crowds. Just in case, they said. The flu had become part of people's thinking, even if they didn't say it out loud. But not all lessons were remembered. In some countries, people believed the flu had only happened to others, to the poor, to soldiers, to people far away. They thought it couldn't happen again. Some leaders even said it had been exaggerated, or that it had been a punishment, or a sign from the heavens. These beliefs were dangerous. They allowed people to forget the truth, that the flu had killed millions without care of class, race, or religion, that it had entered every home, every heart. In the countryside of Canada, a teacher named Mr. Thomas began teaching his students about the Spanish flu. He said, "We learn about war so we don't repeat it. We must learn about sickness too, so we can be ready." His students listened, though some were confused. They had never seen anyone wear a mask. They had never heard of bodies being buried without names. But Mr. Thomas remembered. He told them about the year his little brother died, about the day his mother wore the same dress for 3 funerals, about the way people stopped hugging for fear of spreading death. His voice shook as he spoke. Some students cried, others stayed quiet. All of them remembered.
In the background, newspapers spoke of other things: politics, crime, inventions. The Spanish flu faded from the headlines, but the world it left behind had changed. In hospitals, nurses now wore gloves. In cities, public health officers were hired to watch for new diseases. In labs, scientists worked on ways to fight invisible enemies. In quiet homes, old people whispered to grandchildren, "We lived through the flu. You can live through anything." And in the silence of history books, the Spanish flu waited to be remembered. It waited for a time when people would look back and say, "This mattered. We must not forget." Elsie, now a young woman in London, often visited the graveyard where many flu victims lay. The stones were small, some had no names. She brought flowers to each one. Sometimes she sat and read out loud the stories she had written about her mother, about the doctor who came, and about the neighbors who disappeared. She hoped that someone, somewhere, would listen. Marie, the nurse from Paris, grew old. She lived in a small house near the river. Sometimes young nurses visited her to hear her stories. She showed them how to hold a patient's hand, how to speak gently, how to stay calm even when scared. One evening, a young girl asked her, "Weren't you afraid?" Marie smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "but helping someone else gave me courage." By the end of the 1920s, the world was no longer the same. The Spanish flu had come and gone, but its fingerprints were still everywhere. In the rules, the science, the silence. It had tested humanity, and though it had taken millions, it had also revealed something powerful. That people, even in the face of death, would choose kindness, hope, and love.
The years passed. The scars of the Spanish flu pandemic remained, but they faded with time. People got older. Children grew up. New inventions amazed the world. Televisions, airplanes, new medicines. The 1930s brought economic struggles. The 1940s brought another world war. And as the world faced fresh pain and new disasters, the memories of the flu grew quieter. In many places, it was as if the pandemic had never happened at all. There were no statues in the town squares, no songs to remember the dead. A few books were written, fewer were read. The Spanish flu, which had killed more people than the war, had slipped into the background of history like a shadow. But shadows still move. They whisper. They remind. One of those reminders came years later, in the form of a new child named Anna, born in 1950 in a small village outside London. She was the granddaughter of Elsie, the same Elsie who had watched her mother suffer and survive the flu so many years earlier. Elsie never forgot that time, and she didn't want Anna to grow up without knowing. So, one evening when Anna was old enough to listen, Elsie sat her down by the fire and told her the full story. "The world got sick," Elsie said, brushing Anna's hair with her fingers. "So sick that you could hear coughing from one end of the street to the other. So sick that even the birds went quiet. And we were afraid, not just of dying, but of being alone." Anna listened wide-eyed as Elsie described how she'd cared for her mother with tea and wet clothes, how the church bells rang more for death than for prayer, how neighbors disappeared overnight and never returned. Anna asked, "Why don't they teach us this in school?" Elsie sighed, "Because it hurts too much, and people wanted to forget, but we shouldn't." "Why not?" "Because it taught us something important," Elsie said, "that we need each other, that the strongest thing we have isn't our health or our money, it's our kindness." Across the world, other survivors also share their stories, mostly with grandchildren or students, but these stories rarely made it to history books. Governments were more focused on wars and politics. Scientists moved on to new diseases. And so, generation after generation, the story of the Spanish flu was quietly passed down through families like a secret letter. It was not until nearly 100 years later, in 2020, that the world finally remembered. That year, a new virus spread around the globe. It moved quickly, just like the Spanish flu. It closed schools, emptied streets, filled hospitals. Once again, people wore masks, stood far apart, and waited for the sickness to pass. And suddenly, the world began to ask questions. Has this happened before? What did people do back then? Did they survive? Historians pulled out old journals and letters. Scientists reopened dusty folders with research from 1918. Newspapers printed articles about the Spanish flu. Families remembered stories their grandparents had once told. And the world realized it had happened before. And we had forgotten. But this time, we listened. This time, the Spanish flu was no longer just a shadow. It became a teacher. We learned how people in the past had handled fear, pain, and loss. We learned how they had worked together, cared for one another, and rebuilt. We learned about the mistakes they made, ignoring warnings, holding parades, pretending it wasn't real, and we learned not to repeat them. In 2020, people shared stories on the internet. They posted pictures of family members who had survived 1918. Museums created pages for those who had died. Students wrote essays. Teachers gave lessons. And people lit candles in honor of those who had been forgotten for far too long. Even Elsie's old village, now grown into a busy town, held a small ceremony at the old churchyard where many flu victims had been buried. For the first time, a plaque was placed on the wall. It read, "In memory of those lost to the 1918 pandemic, may we never forget." Back in her home, Anna, now a grown woman, looked through her grandmother's belongings. She found a small notebook with stories, drawings, and names. One name stood out. Her great-grandmother, who nearly died in 1918. Anna smiled and whispered, "Thank you." Today, the Spanish flu is no longer silent. It is studied in schools, remembered in books, respected by doctors, and held close by families who survived it generation after generation. The world still faces sicknesses. It still struggles with pain. But the lessons of 1918 continue to echo. That we must care for one another, that we must act early, wisely, and with love. That silence and forgetfulness are dangerous, and that every life, even the quietest, matters. When the Spanish flu swept the globe, it brought more than death. It brought the truth that in our darkest times, it is our humanity that saves us. And that truth, passed from one heart to another, can never be forgotten. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.